So welcome to our last seminar of the semester. Today we've got FaresAlGhareeb talking about dimensional views of childhood adversity and the role of inhibitory control insights from the Growing Up in New Zealand study. Fares is he's a master's student. He just told me he's finished. He's in the School of Psychology and he's investigating dimensional views of adversity and mental health using Growing Up in New Zealand data. He's got a background in economics. He studied at the University of California, Los Angeles, and he's interested in developmental psychopathology, longitudinal design, and transdiagnostic research. Thank you, Fares.
Thank you, Natalia, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. So today I'm going to be presenting one study from my master's thesis, which was supervised by Dr. Karen Waldy and Dr. Rebecca Slykerman, where we looked at dimensional adversity, inhibitory control, and behavioral and emotional problems using data from the Growing Up in New Zealand study. So just a little bit more about me. As Natalia said, my background is in economics, but upon moving to New Zealand in 2019, had a real interest in psychology, and upon volunteering in various child helplines, kind of wanted to learn more about childhood adversity than we do now. And so just as a broad aim to keep in mind for this presentation, I'm going to look at we're going to test the association of different dimensions of adversity with emotional and behavioral problems in middle childhood through preschool inhibitory control. And so most of us probably already know something about childhood adversity, and this construct is kind of best exemplified by this "you know it when you see it" approach, and that can range in severity from children in Gaza right now to children right here in New Zealand facing things like material hardship and family violence. And it's this kind of saying that is what actually stemmed early research into childhood adversity. So first, psychiatrists in kind of the 70s and 80s used a specificity approach to examine the construct. So that would be kind of in clinical practice, they noticed certain important risk factors and noted that children that have these risk factors tend to experience developmental disadvantage. And as we've begun to establish a lot of different important risk factors, the field kind of transitioned to a cumulative risk approach, which was first pioneered by the foundational ACEs study by Filidi and colleagues. And it was the first study that demonstrated this graded relationship between adversity and disadvantage. So as the number of unique adversities rises, so does your risk for developmental disadvantage. And so what did this early work tell us? So we've been able to establish a lot of patterns through this research. So first, we know that it's very common. Estimates from New Zealand and US population-based studies estimate that around 50% of children have experienced at least one form of adversity. We know that childhood adversity increases the risk for a wide range of outcomes, and it does so in a graded fashion. So things for like asthma, cardiovascular disease, mental health, and physical health. And we've also established specific patterns between adversity and psychopathology specifically. So we know that this relationship holds across multiple categories of psychiatric disorders, so things like mood, personality, and psychotic disorders. We know that it persists across the lifespan from childhood into adulthood, and that this relationship holds across different income levels. And I think kind of ultimately the main takeaway from this research is that we know now which children need intervention the most, and so we know where to direct our resources. And so as we've begun to establish that the field has begun to transition to investigating the mechanisms underlying this relationship. So by and large in the literature, we've focused on the HPA axis and stress response system. And so briefly, this system is a neuroendocrine system that produces cortisol to regulate our body's experiences to stress. And many studies have showed that adversity exposure kind of impairs the system, which is then associated with a wide range of pathology, including both physical and mental health deficits. But there's kind of many limitations to treating this system as kind of a universal pathway between all of adversity and psychopathology. So first of all, many studies report inconsistent associations between the different stress response signatures and the pathology we see. And we're also exactly unsure of when a specific stress response signature is going to translate directly to pathology. So one study that showed this was in a sample of disadvantaged African-American teens showing high cortisol output, which is typically associated with pathology, actually demonstrating psychological resilience rather than psychopathology. And another, I think, important limitation for this is this pathway doesn't explain all of the psychosocial and cognitive deficits we see in children exposed to adversity. And one example of that being language acquisition. So children that have experienced severe adversity typically face language deficits, but there isn't really a common or a logical pathway between stress exposure to language deficits. And I think you can see on this figure on the right, if you look at these two children, let's say the child on the left, let's call him Adam, he experiences physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neighborhood violence, whereas the other child on the right experiences poverty, neglect, and maternal depression. So under the cumulative risk framework, both of these children would receive a score of 3, and we would kind of implicitly assume that the stress pathway would be the primary pathway that would lead to elevated risk for mental health deficits. But we know fundamentally that these two environments are very different. And lastly, I think one important limitation is that even if we were to assume that the HPA axis is a universal mechanism, it kind of limits our ability to intervene. So there's been some interventions that have tried to regulate cortisol, but they show a lot of variation in the literature regarding their efficacy. And so besides that, that kind of leaves only one choice left, which is to prevent adversity entirely from happening in the first place, which, as we know, is an unfeasible target. And so this sets the stage for kind of the main focus of my study, which is looking at a dimensional approach to adversity. So put simply, these models kind of look at a wide array of different experiences and then categorize them into different dimensions based on their shared underlying effects on development. And two popular models that have done this are first the harshness unpredictability framework by Bruce Ellis and colleagues that uses an evolutionary analysis to creating dimensions, and then the threat deprivation framework by Katie McLaughlin and Margaret Sheridan that uses a more of a neurobiological analysis. And so I'm kind of going to give an overview of both of these frameworks and the rationale behind each of the dimensions that it chooses. So first, beginning with the threat deprivation framework. So this framework really relies on cognitive neuroscience principles, mainly that in early life, our brains are really malleable, really plastic, so they're very susceptible to environmental experiences. And two kind of processes kind of dictate how plasticity affects our brain. So those are experience dependent and experience expectant plasticity processes. So the first of those, experience dependent plasticity, reflects learning across the lifespan. So you can kind of think of it as like language acquisition. So it's substantially easier to learn a language when we're younger, but we're still able to keep learning it as we grow older. And then experience expectant plasticity kind of reflects learning that happens within a specific time frame due to a specific stimulus. So we can think of our visual sensory system as a good example of this. So you need to have visual stimuli in early life in order for those neural circuits to develop. And so based on these principles, this framework kind of distills these concepts into two different dimensions. So the first being threat. And kind of a good way to think about this dimension is it's sort of analogous to our concept of trauma, according to the DSM. So it's experiences that expose a child to actual or threats of harm to their survival. And this dimension is hypothesized to act on psychopathology through deficits in social information processing, mainly kind of a bias towards threat identification and biases in emotion regulation. And evidence for this hypothesis comes from a large literature that shows these biases in specifically maltreated children, so children that come from kind of abused backgrounds. And there's a lot of supporting evidence for this pathway. So first, one systematic review showed kind of differential effects of threats on the brain, mainly in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, which is sort of like the alarm system of the brain. And also in other empirical studies that looked at both threat and deprivation, we see a differential association such that only threat is associated with increased risk for psychopathology through deficits in social information mechanisms. And then when it comes to deprivation, whereas like threats refers to the presence of unexpected inputs in our environment, deprivation refers to the absence of inputs that are required for our healthy development. And so because of that, based on that definition, we would hypothesize that deprivation would influence psychopathology through deficits in cognitive ability, mainly things like language and executive functioning. And much of the research or evidence for this hypothesis comes from research on institutionalized children. So we see that they typically face these kinds of deficits in language and executive functioning and also exhibit increased risk for various types of psychopathology. And just as in the threat dimension, we see that there's been neuroscientific evidence that supports a differential effect on the neural circuits typically associated with cognitive ability, and also increased risk for psychopathology through this altered neural circuits and through the neurodevelopmental processes that reflect that. So through things like deficits in language ability and executive functioning. And now onto the second framework that was used in the study. So this is the harshness and predictability framework, which relies on an evolutionary analysis to kind of create these different dimensions of early adversity. So this relies on life history theory, which looks at how we kind of allocate our time and resources to different events that comprise the life cycle. So that can be things like just physical growth to reproduction to mating and things like that. And then the framework argues that different trade-offs happen between these different goals of the life cycle, and that early adversity, mainly in the forms of harshness and unpredictability, kind of dictates what trade-offs we make. And so the kind of the collection of different trade-offs that happen are referred to as our life history strategy. And these occur on a continuum from slow to fast. So a slow life history strategy would be reflected by kind of a tendency to prefer stable pair bonds, low impulsivity, low aggressive behavior, and the like. And a fast life history strategy would reflect the opposite of that. So it would be greater aggressive behavior, greater number of sexual partners, earlier sexual developments. And specifically within this dimension, within this framework, I mean, harshness would reflect to experiences that increase our risk for morbidity and mortality. And this can range in severity from things like war to family violence to poverty. And unpredictability is defined as the random variation in the dimension of harshness. And so kind of instinctively, based on the previous slides, we can kind of see that harshness kind of mirrors the threat and deprivation frameworks. So in this thesis, I was primarily interested in the role of unpredictability as an additional dimension. So just like I mentioned, predictability is the random variation in harshness. And it's most commonly operationalized in Western contexts in terms of parental transitions. So that would be things like the number of residential moves, changes in relationship status, and changes in employment. And the key kind of idea behind this dimension is that greater unpredictability in early life is going to be associated with the future discounting of costs and benefits. So it would lead to a faster life history strategy that would be associated with adaptations that favor short-term gains over future long-term planning. So you can kind of think of that as favoring things like impulsivity in the short term to achieve your ancestral goal of passing on your genes, rather than greater executive control to plan for the future. And just as with threats and deprivation, this dimension has also shown increased risk for psychopathology, and also has shown some associations with reduced executive functioning. Specifically within the study, we're looking at one domain of executive control, which is loosely defined as the ability to carry out goal-directed behavior. And so executive control spans 3 different domains, one being inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And much of the literature has focused on this mechanism because of the association of this process with poor outcomes, that being physical or mental health or even quality of life. And it's also been really interesting to researchers because there's a clear relationship between childhood adversity and executive control. But the goal behind this thesis and study was to understand the antecedents of this relationship further, to understand the precursors from a dimensional perspective. So, and that's because we kind of see a lot of like mixed findings in the literature. So one meta-analysis reported that both threat and deprivation were linked to reduced executive control, but that deprivation showed stronger links with two of the domains in executive control, that being inhibitory control and working memory. Other studies have reported kind of mixed findings for the role of unpredictability, that being either reduced executive control or even enhanced executive control as a sort of adaptation. And to the best of my knowledge, only one study has examined different dimensions from different frameworks in one study. So that being the study by Phillips and colleagues that looked at deprivation and unpredictability. And it showed that deprivation was a more salient risk factor rather than unpredictability in predicting disadvantage in mental health through deficits in executive control. And so also a lot of, it's worth noting that also a lot of this literature is kind of limited by small sample sizes or retrospective assessments of childhood adversity and kind of informants reported executive control, which leads us to my hypotheses for the current study. So we predicted that first, that all adversity dimensions, that being threats, deprivation, and unpredictability, would have indirect effects on emotional and behavioral problems in middle childhood through preschool inhibitory control when examined separately. And then the second hypothesis was that when examined simultaneously, only deprivation would be a key risk factor for this developmental cascade. So to assess these hypotheses, we use data from the Growing Up in New Zealand study. And so briefly, this study is the largest longitudinal study of child health and development, and around 6,843 mothers were recruited based on the following criteria. So having an expected due date between April 2009 and March 2010. And they were also recruited based on living in the areas covered by the Auckland, Counties Manukau, and Waikato district health boards. And that was selected to maximize sociodemographic diversity in the study. And so far, there have been 6 major data collection waves spanning from prior to the children's birth up until 12 years of age, which is the most recent data collection wave. And this is expected to continue until children are 21 years of age. So in the current study, we included participants if they had available data on the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire at age 8 years to measure child behavioral difficulties, and if they also had data on the Luria hand clap task at age 4.5 years. So that yielded us a sample of 4,158 participants, and those with missing data on both these outcomes tended to be of Maori, Pacific, or Asian ethnicity, and have higher levels of behavioral difficulties and living in areas with greater deprivation. So our main outcome of interest was the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which assesses child's emotional and behavioral problems. So briefly, this scale covers multiple dimensions of child behavior, and we were primarily interested in the 4 problems behavior subscales, which span hyperactivity, emotional, peer, and conduct problems. And each of these items were rated on a 3-point Likert scale, and when summed together, yield us a total behavioral difficulty score that is categorized as abnormal to borderline at a score of greater than or equal to 14. And within the current sample, approximately 13% of child participants had total difficulty score in the abnormal to borderline range. And to assess the mediating effects of inhibitory control, we relied on the Luria hand clap task, So this is a kind of developmentally specific measure of inhibitory control and response inhibition, and assesses cool executive functioning. So executive functioning that doesn't rely on emotion. And just briefly, the procedure for this task was child participants were instructed to hold an arbitrary rule in their head and provide and kind of do a reverse imitation of what researchers were doing. So when researchers clapped once, child participants had to clap twice, and vice versa. And there were a total of 16 test trials in total. And for each correct reverse imitation, children received 1 point, which when summed yields a score of between 0 to 16. Then our predictor variables, which are our different adversity dimensions, were measured using mother-reported data within the first 4.5 years of life, and we wanted to restrict that to kind of have a sensitive period of early life development. And I can kind of go over this more in depth later on, but briefly, we use kind of a wide range of either external scales or in-house growing up in New Zealand developed items to categorize each of these dimensions. And each adversity indicator was kind of assigned a cutoff threshold, either specified by the scale itself or kind of relied on a 90th percentile cutoff to ensure higher levels of adversity. Yeah. And here's a broad overview of our data analysis plan. So we first conducted collinearity diagnostics and bivariate correlation analyses to look for multicollinearity across all our adversity indicators, and that warranted no further investigation. Missing data was low across all of these indicators, ranging between 0 to approximately 5%. And where there was missing data on a given indicator, we kind of imputed a 0 in that sense. So we treated participants as being absent on that particular adversity indicator as kind of a conservative approach. And then to test our hypotheses, we use mediated multiple regression to test each of our hypotheses. So the first being we conducted 3 separate mediation models to test each individual dimension separately, that being threat, deprivation, and unpredictability with our outcome and mediator. And then in the second part of the analysis, did a combined mediation model where all adversity dimensions were included simultaneously. And the covariates within the study included maternal ethnicity and gender as our sociodemographic covariates. And then we also included the age of assessment for the Luria hand clap task because of the confounding effect that age can have on executive control performance. And also to kind of demonstrate effects above and beyond previous behavioral difficulties, we also controlled for emotional and behavioral problems at age 4.5. And so we used also non-parametric bootstrapping with 10,000 bootstrap samples for indirect effects, and also used a Bonferroni correction for multiple testing across mediation models. And so here's just a few descriptive statistics before we get to our mediation models. So as I said before, approximately 13% of the sample had borderline to abnormal behavioral difficulties, and 1/3 of the sample were living in a high deprivation area when they were born. 10.5% of the sample experienced no adversity. So that indicates that adversity exposure was pretty common or prevalent across the sample. And only approximately 5% of the sample experienced only threats, 15% experienced only deprivation, and 10% experienced only unpredictability. So this slide represents the analysis for our first hypothesis. So we conducted 3 separate mediation models looking at indirect and direct effects of deprivation, threats, and unpredictability on total behavioral difficulties through inhibitory control. So some patterns we see from these findings is that all adversity dimensions had direct effects on total behavioral difficulties. So greater levels of adversity in any given dimension was associated with greater behavioral and emotional problems. Inhibitory control was associated with lower total behavioral difficulties across all models. So greater inhibitory control is associated with fewer behavioral and emotional problems. And also when examined separately, each dimension showed indirect effects through inhibitory control. And it's also worth noting, while the effects were kind of small, ranging from 0.01 to 0.02, this is expected given the short time interval being investigated in the study, which was just 3 years between both the mediator and the outcomes assessments. And also just looking at one particular domain of executive control. And so moving on to the second hypothesis test that we did, we included all adversity dimensions within one combined mediation model. And we see that all adversity dimensions had significant direct effects on total behavioral difficulties, but that when examined simultaneously, only deprivation was associated with reduced inhibitory control. And so threats and unpredictability were not significantly related to our mediator anymore. And lastly, we showed that deprivation showed a significant indirect effect on total behavioral difficulties through reduced preschool inhibitory control. And so what are kind of the main, I guess, takeaways from this research? I think the implications are kind of three-pronged. So they span theoretical, clinical, and policy implications. So first, I think the results highlight the utility of dimensional perspectives and kind of understanding the how and why of development over a cumulative risk strategy. And we also kind of demonstrate the importance of investigating multiple dimensions from different frameworks. So it kind of adds to the literature in terms of the salience of deprivation over other types of dimensions and predicting disadvantage in this developmental cascade. And there's also some clinical implications. So we kind of see inhibitory control as this transdiagnostic mechanism that when examined separately confers risk from all types of adversity dimensions to emotional and behavioral problems, and also kind of posits this mechanism as a potential target for intervention and prevention of childhood behavioral difficulties. And with regards to policy, I think kind of having these adversity dimensions within a specific time frame between birth to 4.5 years emphasizes the importance of this phase in childhood development and the importance of policies designed to address early disadvantage from preventing disparities from deteriorating further. And it's also kind of based on the conceptualization of the different predictors in our study. We see that there's a need for investments in physical, social, human, and economic resources for optimal childhood development. And this is particularly noteworthy because interventions for executive control deficits have been shown to be proven most successful when executive control is already low and when you're simultaneously addressing material and psychosocial needs. So that's kind of like a two-pronged approach for national policy, I think. And yeah, some future research directions for this research, I think, that can be conducted either with growing up in New Zealand data or even data using the IDI. So first, with growing up data, we could potentially extend these analyses to kind of a more cohesive mediator, such as the NIH Cognition Toolbox Battery. So that would allow us to look at more specific domains of executive control simultaneously. And then with future research with the IDI, we can leverage big data to investigate a fourth dimension of adversity that's often underlooked in the literature, which is the effects of grief or loss. And we could also potentially use kind of a dimensional perspective on mental health simultaneously with a dimensional perspective on childhood adversity. So the IDI can provide us with diagnostic data for psychopathology, and we can model that as a dimensional construct to look at specific associations between each adversity dimension and kind of parse out specific versus general forms of psychopathology, such as internalizing or externalizing. And lastly, I think using that this kind of national big data could also provide kind of a natural experiment where we'd be able to target children that grew up with during the COVID pandemic, and that would kind of have a built-in unpredictability potential to kind of study that, which I think could be interesting to investigate further. But yeah, I think this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and would be excited to look at these questions kind of further. So yeah, that kind of brings me to the end of my study. Yeah, happy to answer any questions now.
Thanks. All this for a master's.
Yes.
Oh my God, that's a lot of work.
Thank you.
I've got a couple of. So first of all, so you looked at SDQ scores at 8.
Yes.
And I thought it's interesting that only 13% of the sample had abnormal or borderline, because you would expect it to be around 20%.
Yes, I think that might have been kind of a limitation of our strategy for handling missing data, because children with missing data had higher behavioral difficulties. Yeah.
So the chances are, yeah, those children just
were missing.
Because I think when Steph first looked at 2-year data, she found it was about 20%. But I guess those are the children maybe we've lost in the study.
Yeah.
That we have lost.
Yeah.
That was my second question. My third question is, have you looked at whether the pathways that or the models look differently for boys and girls? Like, are those patterns similar for boys and girls, or are they different?
Yes. It's a shame I had those slides in, but I wasn't sure if I was going to have enough time. But we did additional sensitivity analyses that looked at the same pathways across boys and girls. And if I do remember correctly, the effect was more pronounced for girls. And then if you look at that with ethnicity, it's more pronounced for, I think, girls of non-Pakeha descent.
Okay.
Yeah, but
awesome.
Yeah, not awesome, but yeah. So I think that was like really interesting and potentially something to look further in future research. But yeah, it's a shame I didn't have that on here. It's not in that paper either, but maybe you could advise us to put it in. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It was really amazing talk. Really.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. You just briefly said that the effects are small, but I couldn't really understand the dimensions of your variables. Can you briefly explain kind of what an effect of 0.4 means?
Yeah, so an effect of kind of 0.4 would be so we use the SDQ as a continuous measure. So it would be a score ranging from 1 to 40. So it'd be 0.4 kind of behavioral difficulties higher, which I admit is kind of a small estimate. But again, I think those estimates make sense given you would typically expect greater jumps if we were looking at like using like diagnostic data or like more kind of gold standard tools for screening psychopathology, like using things like the child behavior checklist or things like that. But the SDQ is kind of more of a general emotional and behavioral problem subscale that's kind of more used in epidemiological samples rather than clinical samples.
And the explanatory variables, they were also kind of scalars. So you could have like 1, 2, 3 threats, for example, as you showed in the descriptives. So they were the same as in the descriptives.
Yes. Yeah. So I should have mentioned all adversity dimensions were winsorized at the 95th percentile because we had really low frequencies of adversity in those upper numbers. So yeah, so the threats composite score ranged from 0 to 3, deprivation from 0 to 4, and predictability from 0 to 3 again. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
No problem.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you saw that deprivation was very relevant factor for your analysis, even though it's a 5-level variable. Even having 5-level variable, it was a significant effect. My question is, according to what you have read so far, I think deprivation is a huge variable.
Yes.
Is there any way that you can kind of understand what aspect of deprivation is affecting the most, or because I think it implies so many things.
Yes.
Like contextual aspects of maybe family, or you know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So interesting. Another sensitivity analysis that we did was splitting our deprivation predictor into two different parts. So we split it into kind of a cognitive-based deprivation and a material-based deprivation. So if I just circle back to this slide. So if you look at the deprivation column, we used both material and cognitive-based forms of deprivation. So material-based forms would include things like neighborhood deprivation or material deprivation, which is basically assessing kind of poverty. So how often you buy cheaper food to afford other necessities? Are you able to afford a prescription for your sick child? That kind of thing. And then the latter three variables are more of a cognitive stimulation-based variable. So they would include questions and items like, how often do you read to your baby? How often do you encourage them to print or read numbers and words? And so what we found was when you separate those two, all those variables into two different composite scores, the pathways kind of look different. So inhibitory control actually explains all of the association between cognitive deprivation and emotional and behavioral problems, but it didn't fully mediate it for the material deprivation-based score. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think a next step would kind of be to do kind of a serial mediation model to see how kind of material-based deprivation leads to cognitive-based deprivation, which then leads to poor inhibitory control, and then emotional and behavioral problems, which is a mouthful to say out loud. Yeah, it's really interesting. And
I know it's not just three variables,
Yeah.
parental cognitive stimulations.
Yes.
Different variables that.
It's like those would be like the sum scores, but it's like the parental cognitive stimulation used a total of 10 items across 2 ages to calculate that. And I think it's actually interesting. So like once you look at when you separate the two into cognitive and material-based forms of deprivation, so you find that cognitive deprivation is fully mediated by inhibitory control and material deprivation isn't. And when you look at research that kind of looks at disadvantaged families, they know the importance of cognitive stimulation for their child. So that I think that also kind of has a policy implication where kind of maybe kind of infers that maybe parenting strategies aren't the most effective solution for this kind of problem, but more of a material-based intervention is needed, I think.
Yeah, I have another question. So the SDQs also have 24 to 54 months data, right?
Yes.
So do you think you will have the same results with prior data collection? Like, because you use the 8, right? Do you think will be kind of
I think it might be a bit too soon. Like for my study, we looked at this pathway with emotional and behavioral problems at age 8. Typically within this literature, they tend to look at more adolescent outcomes. So I think it's both interesting that we get to see it this early, like these deficits appearing in middle childhood, but also I wouldn't know how to investigate that because I don't think we have any mediators at age 2.
Yeah, because the inhibitory control.
I think it's great to see it because at 8 they already entered like primary school. There's more social context in the environment. So I think it's good. I just wanted to know what
I think maybe like that kind of question might be better answered with IDI data. So you could substitute inhibitory control with like numeracy or literacy rates. So I'm not sure if there's any like kind of standardized assessments then at that age. No. Okay.
There are, but the data's not in the IDI.
Oh, that's a shame.
Most like standardized assessments within schools, the data's held by the schools and it's not supplied to Ministry of Education.
Okay.
So there's a big gap in what we know about children's kind of achievement at school or performance at school. up until they essentially do their NCEA when's NCEA 1, 14, 15, yeah.
So do we have the data from the NCEA
Yes.
onwards, but not
Yeah.
anything before that? Okay, yeah,
No.
yeah, tricky.
And I was thinking about what you said about COVID. I think that could work in two different ways. In some ways, that was a very unpredictable time.
Yes.
But for some children, there was maybe more predictability because they couldn't move house. They couldn't, especially, it was a long period for peak children in Auckland. So there's a mixture of predictability and unpredictability, which is maybe unpredictability. But yeah, I think it would be difficult to.
I think that's like kind of I mentioned earlier when I was talking about unpredictability generally that there's been mixed findings that show both deficits and improvements in executive control. And in the studies that have proved improvements, they were kind of unable to say whether that occurred because it was unpredictable, but they shifted from kind of a low SES to a high SES environment. And I think what would be interesting with the IDI data is to not do kind of an ancestral cues perspective and predictability, but use a statistical perspective. So it'd be the fluctuations in income and kind of modeling that as like a random / fixed effects kind of thing, just because of the data that we have with the IDI. I think that would be interesting.
Easy to do. You can do that with growing up, but it gets very complex.
Yes.
And there's a lot of missing data for income.
Yes, I tried coding those income and employment variables, and I was like, "This is a 1-year master." So not trying to do that at all.
My question is one of those big kind of bigger picture ones. I do a bit of work in Tonga around this sort of childhood adversity thing in the region, and kind of have thought about it a lot for New Zealand, a little bit of it with the growing up work too. And I guess in doing this work, and I heard you talk about sort of the recommendations and the thoughts from the findings. But I'm keen to hear what you think about the how. Like, how do we use these data, these kind of studies, to continue to really lobby governments, lobby communities to kind of bring change, because these issues are multi-sectoral. They involve all levels of society, and it hurts your brain to try and think about what the best solutions are. But I'm interested in what you came up with when you were doing this work. Malo pito.
Thank you so much for your question. And big question. I think to think of how to lobby these findings to create change, especially when kind of the answers point to both the clinical interventions for these childhood development disparities and just literally a need for increased material well-being. I think one thing that I found interesting while looking at these findings is I kind of didn't mention this. This was for the first study in my thesis. I looked at a dimensional view of mental health, and so in that literature, there's this theory called dynamic mutualism, which is when different symptoms of externalizing or internalizing pathology reinforce each other over time to establish long-term comorbidity. And I was really interested in that potential leverage because of the mental health crisis we see in New Zealand, whether that's something that can kind of be leveraged as like a way to potentially mobilize people, if people can kind of conceptualize their mental health beginning from when they were kids, and how like disorders can have kind of continuity across the different developmental stages, then that could potentially be a way to mobilize people, that this doesn't start kind of it does sometimes, but other times it really does start from when you're young. So
just picking up on that, did you look at did you do a sensitivity analysis for externalizing and internalizing?
No, we didn't do that.
Would be really
that would be cool.
My view is that the mental health crisis we're seeing with young people today is it reflects a lot of internalization. So, and the outward behavior, all
Yeah.
the studies show that their outward behavior is better than previous generations. They're not drinking as much alcohol, they're not
Yes.
smoking, they're not having unsafe sex. But
Yes.
their internalization seems to be creating like high levels of depression and anxiety.
Yeah, those are the
It
two
would be super
ones.
cool to look at.
That would be really cool.
for this.
Yeah, yeah, that would be really interesting. It would also be interesting just to repeat the analyses with, instead of the SDQ, just depression and anxiety
Yeah.
skills that we have,
Yeah,
and see what
so
that
is that.
finds. But
Who's working on that data?
I think Lucy, you're using depression data, right?
Yes, I am.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah,
I think
do.
interestingly enough, I don't think anyone has worked on the anxiety data
Oh,
actually, which would be interesting to look at too.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of work there because I don't think we
Yeah.
validated those scales or looked at the psychometric properties either.
Mm.
So that would be a big undertaking,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming in.
Oh.